I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding laundry in a cramped apartment, wiping down a counter after a long shift, or heading home on a crowded subway, shoulders heavy with silence. Rosa's hands trembled as she picked up the crystal fragments from the marble floor, each piece cutting deeper than her calloused skin could feel. The mansion's cold silence pressed against her like a judge's verdict she could never appeal. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. In the heart of Miami's Coral Gables, where Mediterranean revival mansions sprawled like sleeping giants beneath swaying palm trees, the Hargrave estate stood as a monument to old money and older wounds. The morning sun painted the white stucco walls gold, but inside, shadows ruled with iron fists. Rosa Martinez had walked these marble hallways for 18 months, her soft-soled shoes whispering secrets to the imported Italian tiles. Each step echoed with the weight of invisible labor, the kind that kept palaces breathing while the workers suffocated in silence. At 52, Rosa carried more than cleaning supplies in her worn canvas bag. She carried the dreams she'd folded away like pressed flowers between prayer book pages, the hopes she'd packed tight when she left her small apartment in Hialeah every morning before dawn. Her weathered hands, marked by years of bleach and broken promises, moved with practiced grace across surfaces that cost more than most people's annual salaries. The scent of lemon oil and resignation clung to her uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen better decades. The Hargrave fortune stretched beyond comprehension. Real estate investments spanning from Miami Beach penthouses to Manhattan high-rises. Stock portfolios that fluctuated like Miami weather. Cryptocurrency holdings that Victor's late wife had insisted on purchasing when Bitcoin was still a mysterious word whispered in tech circles. Money flowed through this house like the central air conditioning, constant and costly, yet somehow never warming the spaces where human hearts should beat. Constance Hargrave ruled this empire of marble and malice from her throne of inherited wealth. At 78, her silver hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the kindness right out of her sharp features. Her fingers, adorned with rings worth more than Rosa's lifetime earnings, drummed against polished surfaces with the rhythm of someone perpetually disappointed. The widow's black pearls caught the light like tears she'd never shed, and her voice carried the particular coldness that only money could buy, and loneliness could perfect. Rosa had learned to read the weather patterns of Constance's moods. The way her heels clicked against tile spoke volumes. Sharp, staccato beats meant trouble brewing like a summer storm over Biscayne Bay. This morning, those heels announced themselves long before their owner appeared, each step a warning that echoed through the foyer where Rosa was polishing the grandfather clock's brass pendulum. The clock itself was a masterpiece imported from Switzerland, its face adorned with Roman numerals that seemed to judge time as harshly as its owner judged people. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound had become Rosa's metronome, marking days that blended into each other like watercolors in rain. She'd grown to hate that sound, the way it seemed to mock every moment of silence between her and the family she served, but could never truly reach. Victor Hargrave Jr. moved through his inherited kingdom like a ghost haunting his own life. At 55, he possessed the kind of hollow handsomeness that grief had carved from what once must have been vibrant features. His wife Margaret's death 3 years prior had left him adrift in an ocean of memories and regrets, his vast wealth useless against the tsunami of loss that had swept away his capacity for joy. He dressed in expensive suits that hung on his frame like designer shrouds, his eyes holding the particular emptiness of a man who had everything except the one thing money couldn't buy back. The mansion's 23 rooms breathed with the kind of silence that money bought. Soundproofed walls that kept secrets in and authenticity out. Persian rugs worth small fortunes muffled footsteps, while crystal chandeliers scattered rainbow fragments across surfaces that Rosa polished until they gleamed like fresh wounds. The kitchen alone was larger than most Miami apartments, its commercial-grade appliances standing like soldiers in formation, ready for battles that never came since the family rarely gathered for meals anymore. Rosa's own world existed in the spaces between their grandeur. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hialeah with her teenage nephew Miguel, who she'd raised since her sister's death 5 years earlier. Their building sat in the shadow of newer constructions, its salmon-pink paint peeling like sunburned skin under the relentless Florida sun. The morning commute from her world to theirs required 2 buses and a 40-minute journey through neighborhoods that shifted from working-class Hispanic to old-money Anglo, like scenes from different movies. Each morning at 5:30, Rosa waited at the bus stop on West Hialeah Drive, her thermos of café con leche warming her hands while streetlights still competed with stars. She carried her dignity in the straightness of her spine, her hope in the grandmother's rosary wrapped around her wrist, and her strength in the silence she'd learned to wear like armor. The other domestics waiting for the same route recognized each other without formal introductions. They shared the universal uniform of early mornings and invisible labor. By 7 o'clock, she was transforming from Rosa the woman into Rosa the maid, her personality carefully folded away like the street clothes she changed out of in the servants' bathroom. The Hargraves had made it clear from her first day that familiarity was forbidden. She was expected to exist like furniture, necessary, functional, and silent unless spoken to. The crystal vase incident had happened on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, until it didn't. Rosa was dusting the living room's enormous entertainment center, a wall of technology worth more than most people's homes, when her elbow caught the edge of the baccarat crystal vase. Time slowed as the piece arced through the air, its prismatic surface catching and fracturing the morning light. The sound of impact was sharp and final, like a gavel declaring her guilty before trial. Constance's appearance was instantaneous, as if she'd been lurking just beyond sight, waiting for such moments. Her eyes swept over the destruction with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just been handed the perfect evidence. The crystal pieces lay scattered across the marble like frozen tears, each fragment reflecting Rosa's face in distorted angles. The words came like ice picks. "Clumsy girl, that vase was worth more than you'll earn in 5 years. If you break anything, it comes out of your pay." The cruel mathematics of the statement hung in the air like humidity. Rosa's monthly salary was $1,200, cash, no benefits. The vase, Constance informed her with obvious pleasure, had been purchased at auction for $18,000. But what Constance didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rosa carried within her the accumulated wisdom of women who had survived worse storms than wealthy widows' cruelty. Her mother's voice echoed from childhood memories spent in a small house in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. "Mija, cuando te caes, te levantas más fuerte. When you fall, you rise stronger." Rosa had learned to transform humiliation into fuel, condescension into determination. That evening, Rosa walked to a small shop in Little Havana that she'd noticed during previous bus rides home. Flores y Recuerdos, the sign read in faded gold letters. Inside, beneath the scent of fresh marigolds and old wood, she found Don Aurelio, a man in his 70s whose hands held the particular steadiness of someone who spent his life putting broken things back together. Don Aurelio examined the crystal fragments Rosa had carefully collected, turning each piece like a jeweler examining diamonds. His fingers, gnarled but gentle, traced the edges where clean breaks promised possible reunions. "Si se puede," he murmured, his accent thick with the poetry of his native Cuba. "It can be done, but it will take time and money. The restoration would cost $600, half of Rosa's monthly salary, but something in Don Aurelio's eyes, a recognition of one survivor meeting another, made her nod. She would find the money. She would bring this beautiful, broken thing back to life, not because Constance deserved it, but because Rosa refused to let wealthy cruelty define her worth. For the next 6 weeks, Rosa lived on rice and beans, walked instead of taking buses when possible, and saved every dollar she could squeeze from her already tight budget. Miguel noticed his aunt's increased frugality but said nothing, understanding with teenagers' intuitive wisdom that something important was happening in the spaces between words. Meanwhile, the Hargrave mansion continued its daily performance of dysfunction disguised as propriety. Victor's twin daughters, Sophia and Isabella, both 17 and sharp as their grandmother's tongue, treated Rosa with the casual cruelty that privilege teaches its children. They left messes deliberately, spoke about her in third person while she stood in the same room, and laughed at jokes that used her accent as their punchline. Yet Rosa observed them with the careful eye of someone who understood that cruelty often grew from its own kind of pain. Sophia's perfect smile never quite reached her eyes, while Isabella's sharp wit seemed designed to cut others before they could wound her first. They were their grandmother's students in the art of emotional distance, but Rosa could see the cracks in their performances, the places where grief and confusion leaked through like water through damaged foundations. Victor himself remained professionally polite but personally absent, moving through his home like a guest at his own life's funeral. Rosa noticed the way his hand shook slightly during his morning coffee, how he sometimes stood at his deceased wife's portrait for long minutes as if waiting for it to speak. Margaret's ghost haunted every room, her absence more present than most people's company. The transformation began with small acts of rebellion disguised as service. When Isabella came home from school with red eyes and a story about friendship betrayal, Rosa left a cup of her grandmother's té de manzanilla on the girl's nightstand with a note written in careful English, for healing hearts and hushing cruel words. When Sophia struggled with college applications and the pressure of living up to the Hargrave name, Rosa quietly left orchids by her window, flowers that bloomed beautifully in difficult conditions. The house itself began to respond to these subtle changes, like a patient awakening from anesthesia. Colors seemed brighter in rooms where Rosa hummed old boleros while working. The kitchen, long sterile as an operating theater, warmed when she prepared simple meals that filled the space with aromas of garlic, cilantro, and comfort. Victor began to notice the woman who had been invisible for so long. Perhaps it was the way she folded his shirts with obvious care, creasing each seam with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. Maybe it was how she never rushed through tasks, but approached each one as if it were a small prayer requiring proper attention. Or possibly it was simply that her presence had become associated with the house feeling less like a mausoleum and more like a home. One evening in late September, as Rosa was finishing her duties in the living room where the vase had once stood, Victor appeared in the doorway. The space where the baccarat crystal had been remained conspicuously empty, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. "Rosa," he said, and she was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "I wanted to ask you about the vase. My mother mentioned it was being repaired." Rosa's hand stilled on the dust cloth she was folding. The vase had been ready for 2 weeks, sitting in Don Aurelio's shop while she gathered courage for this moment. "Sí, Señor Victor, it is ready to return home." Something in her phrasing, return home rather than return here, seemed to strike him unexpectedly. His eyes, usually so distant, focused on her face with sudden attention. "How much did the repair cost?" Rosa straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "It does not matter, Señor. Some things must be fixed, regardless of cost." The next morning, Rosa arrived carrying the restored vase, wrapped carefully in soft cloth like a newborn baby. Don Aurelio had worked miracles, using traditional Japanese kintsugi techniques to mend the breaks with lines of gold, making the repair part of the piece's beauty, rather than attempting to hide its history of damage. The vase was no longer perfect in the way Constance demanded perfection, but it was beautiful in a way that spoke to survival and the artistry of healing. Rosa placed it back on its pedestal and waited. When Constance discovered the restoration, her reaction was swift and predictable. "What is this mockery? Those gold lines, they're hideous. The vase is ruined." But Victor, studying the piece more carefully, saw something different. The golden veins that traced the former breaks seemed to tell a story about resilience, about finding beauty in repair rather than shame in damage. For the first time in months, something stirred in his chest that wasn't grief or emptiness. "I think it's more beautiful now," he said quietly, his words falling into the room's silence like stones into still water. Constance's face flushed with anger at this betrayal. "Victor, surely you're not siding with the help over your own mother?" The word help hung in the air like a slap, reducing Rosa to nothing more than hired functionality. But Victor found himself seeing Rosa differently now. not as furniture with human features, but as a woman who had chosen grace over bitterness, creation over destruction. The household's dynamics began shifting like tectonic plates beneath an apparently stable surface. Isabella started leaving books of poetry on tables where Rosa worked, their pages marked with passages about strength and survival. Sophia began saying "good morning" in careful Spanish, her pronunciation improving with practice. Even the other staff members noticed the change, the way conversations gentled when Rosa entered rooms, how the mansion's chronic chill seemed to warm by degrees. But Constance, feeling her iron control slipping, escalated her campaign of psychological warfare. She began following Rosa through her daily routines, searching for flaws like a detective gathering evidence for a case already decided. She criticized the way Rosa folded fitted sheets, the order in which she dusted furniture, the speed at which she vacuumed Persian rugs. Each critique was designed not to improve performance but to establish dominance, to remind everyone who held power in this carefully constructed hierarchy. Rosa absorbed these attacks with the patience of someone who understood that cruelty often came from its own kind of poverty. She had learned long ago that responding to meanness with meanness only gave it more room to grow. Instead, she continued her quiet work of transformation, tending to the house and its inhabitants like a gardener who trusted in seeds planted in dark soil. The breakthrough came during a November evening, when Miami's version of winter sent cool breezes through the mansion's many windows. Victor's younger daughter, Isabella, had fallen ill with a fever that left her shivering despite the house's perfect climate control. The family doctor had prescribed rest and fluids, but Isabella's body seemed unable to find comfort in her luxurious bedroom with its designer furniture and expensive linens. Rosa, finishing her evening duties, heard the girls' restless movements through the thin walls that separated the family quarters from the service areas. Without permission or invitation, she prepared a simple soup from ingredients she found in the kitchen: chicken broth rich with garlic and cilantro, rice soft enough for a sick stomach, and vegetables cut small enough for a 17-year-old who had forgotten how to accept comfort from adults. She climbed the curved staircase that had always felt like a barrier between worlds, her feet silent on the imported marble steps. Isabella's room was dark except for the glow of her phone screen, her expensive silk pajamas twisted with restless sleep. "Miss Isabella," Rosa whispered, setting the tray on the nightstand. "I brought you something for your stomach." The girl's eyes opened, focusing with surprise on Rosa's presence in this private space. In the dim light, Isabella looked younger than her 17 years, vulnerable in a way that expensive education and designer clothing couldn't hide. "You made this for me." Isabella's voice was hoarse with fever and something that might have been wonder. Rosa helped her sit up, arranging pillows with the same care she used for the most delicate crystal. As Isabella sipped the warm broth, something passed between them that had nothing to do with employer and employee, everything to do with woman and girl, kindness offered and gratefully received. Victor, drawn by voices from his daughter's room, found them there. Rosa sitting quietly in the chair beside the bed, while Isabella finished the soup that seemed to be bringing color back to her pale cheeks. The scene possessed an intimacy that money couldn't buy, a tenderness that had been absent from his house since Margaret's death. "She's been taking care of me," Isabella said when she noticed her father in the doorway, her voice carrying surprise at her own words. Rosa rose to leave, gathering the empty bowl and spoon with quiet efficiency. But Victor's voice stopped her at the door. "Rosa." She turned, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried weight that both of them understood. For the first time in 18 months, he had seen her not as hired help, but as a woman whose instinct was to heal rather than harm, to offer comfort rather than demand payment for kindness. That night marked the beginning of what Constance would later describe as rebellion, but what felt to everyone else like the house slowly remembering how to breathe. Rosa's presence began to soften the sharp edges that had defined the Hargrave mansion for too long. She brought music back into spaces that had been silent since Margaret's death, humming old songs while she worked that seemed to lift the oppressive quiet that had settled over everything like dust. The golden Christmas season brought its own challenges. The Hargraves traditionally hosted an elaborate party for Miami's social elite, an event that required weeks of preparation and perfect execution. Rosa found herself working longer hours, polishing silver that hadn't been touched since the previous year's performance of Wealth and Status. But this year, something was different. Isabella and Sophia began helping with preparations, learning from Rosa how to fold napkins into elegant shapes, how to arrange flowers so they looked naturally abundant rather than artificially perfect. Victor supervised the wine selection, but asked Rosa's opinion about the food, listening carefully to her suggestions about dishes that would satisfy both sophisticated palates and human hungers. Constance watched these developments with growing alarm. The careful hierarchy she had constructed was dissolving before her eyes, replaced by something that looked dangerously like genuine affection and mutual respect. Her attempts to reassert control grew more desperate and creative. The crisis came 3 days before the Christmas party, when Constance's pearl necklace, a family heirloom worth $40,000, disappeared from her jewelry box. The accusation landed on Rosa like a physical blow, delivered with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "I know it was you," Constance declared, her voice carrying the fake sorrow of someone performing grief over betrayal. "You're the only one with access to my room. That necklace belonged to my grandmother. How could you steal from a family that has shown you such kindness?" Rosa stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the entire household staff and family members called to witness her public humiliation. The restored vase caught afternoon light from its perch, its golden veins seeming to pulse like a wounded heart. "Señora Constance," Rosa said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm breaking around her. "I did not take your necklace." But Constance had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign. She had already searched Rosa's locker, her purse, even called the police to report the theft. The performance was complete, designed not just to fire Rosa, but to destroy any possibility of her finding similar work in Miami's tight-knit community of wealthy families. Victor stood silent during the accusation, his face a mask of conflict and confusion. The daughters exchanged glances that spoke of their own doubts, but they too remained quiet as their grandmother delivered her verdict with judicial authority. "Pack your things and leave immediately," Constance commanded. "Consider yourself fortunate that I'm not pressing charges." Rosa walked to the servants' bathroom where her street clothes waited in a small locker. Her movements were deliberate and dignified, refusing to give Constance's performance the dramatic finale it demanded. She changed slowly, folding her uniform with the same care she'd given to the family's belongings, leaving it on the shelf as neat as everything else she'd touched in this house. As she gathered her few personal items, her thermos, her rosary, her small radio that had filled empty rooms with gentle music, Rosa felt the weight of 18 months dissolving into memory. But she felt no bitterness, only a profound sadness for people who had confused wealth with worth, power with purpose. At the mansion's front door, she turned for one last look at the space that had been her daily world. The restored vase seemed to wink at her, its golden scars catching light like tears transformed into jewelry. Nobody said goodbye. Victor avoided her eyes. The daughters disappeared into their rooms, and Constance stood at her victory like a general surveying conquered territory. Rosa walked down the curved driveway alone, her soft-soled shoes silent on expensive stones, carrying nothing but dignity and the knowledge that some bonds cannot be bought or sold. The mansion behind her settled into silence again, but it was a different silence than before. Not peaceful but guilty, not pristine but poisoned by the taste of injustice served cold. Rosa returned to Hialeah carrying invisible wounds but unbroken spirit. Miguel met her at the door with wordless understanding, making café con leche while she sat at their small kitchen table and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came not from self-pity but from exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that came from loving people who couldn't see past their own pain to recognize the grace being offered. For 3 weeks, Rosa searched for new employment while living on savings that dwindled like hopes in drought. Miami's wealthy families seemed to whisper among themselves, Constance's influence reaching into drawing rooms and charity luncheons like poison in wells. Doors that might have opened remained firmly closed. But sometimes justice moves in mysterious ways, wearing disguises that fool even the guilty. Maria Santos, the junior housekeeper who had worked alongside Rosa for 8 months, finally gathered enough courage to speak the truth. She had found Constance's pearl necklace 3 days after Rosa's firing, wedged between cushions in the living room sofa, where its owner had carelessly dropped it during her nightly television viewing. Maria had been afraid to speak up immediately, terrified of losing her own job in a household where loyalty was demanded but never rewarded. But watching Rosa's empty locker, seeing the way the house had returned to its previous coldness, she finally understood that silence in the face of injustice made her complicit in cruelty. Victor received the confession in his office, the pearls lying across his desk like evidence of his own moral failure. Each luminescent bead seemed to accuse him of cowardice, of choosing comfort over conscience when the moment had demanded he stand for truth. The search for Rosa took him into neighborhoods he had never entered, worlds that existed parallel to his own privileged reality. In Hialeah, he navigated streets where Spanish flowed like music and small businesses carried the dreams of families who had traveled far to find them. The contrast between his Coral Gables mansion and Rosa's apartment building was like comparing cathedral to chapel, different in scale but not in the dignity of what happened within their walls. Rosa's building superintendent, an elderly Cuban man named Carlos, regarded Victor with undisguised suspicion. The expensive suit and obvious wealth marked him as someone from the world that usually brought trouble rather than solutions for people like them. "Rosa Martinez, why you want to find her?" Carlos asked, his English careful but clear. Victor found himself struggling to explain, the weight of his guilt making words difficult. "I need to apologize," he said finally. "My family did her a terrible wrong." Something in his tone, the genuine remorse that couldn't be faked, softened Carlos's expression. He directed Victor to the Hialeah Community Center, where Rosa had been volunteering while searching for work, helping elderly Cuban immigrants navigate social services and medical appointments. Victor found her there on a Thursday afternoon, sitting beside an ancient woman whose hand shook with Parkinson's as Rosa helped her fill out Medicare paperwork. The scene was intimate and patient, Rosa's voice gentle as she explained each form in Spanish that flowed like water over stones. When Rosa looked up to see Victor standing in the doorway, her face showed neither surprise nor joy, only the calm recognition of someone who had been expecting this moment without knowing when it would arrive. "Señor Victor," she said, rising to guide the elderly woman to a more comfortable chair before approaching him. "You found me." "Rosa, Victor's prepared speech crumbled in the face of her quiet dignity. "The necklace. Maria found it in the couch. You were innocent, and I should have believed you." Rosa studied his face for a long moment, seeing something there that hadn't been present during their previous interactions. Humility, raw and uncomfortable in a man accustomed to certainty. "I know," she said simply. "You know? How could you know?" "Because I did not take it. Truth is patient, Señor Victor. It waits." They sat together in the community center's folding chairs, surrounded by the sounds of people helping people, of problems being solved through kindness rather than money. Victor tried to apologize, to explain his mother's influence and his own confusion, but Rosa's quiet presence made his words feel inadequate. "I would like you to come back," he said finally. "Not as before, as someone the family respects, as someone we value properly." Rosa was quiet for so long that Victor wondered if she had heard him. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of consideration. "The house needs healing," she said, "but not just cleaning or cooking. Real healing. Are you ready for that kind of change?" Victor thought about his daughters, growing up beautiful but cold, about his mother, isolated in her tower of accumulated bitterness, about himself, sleepwalking through days that money filled but meaning had abandoned. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "I think we are." Rosa's return to the Hargrave mansion was quiet, unmarked by fanfare or formal announcements. She simply appeared one Monday morning at her usual time, carrying her thermos and her dignity, wearing the same uniform but somehow transformed by the journey she'd taken through injustice and survival. The house itself seemed to exhale with relief. Colors brightened in rooms where she worked, sounds softened, and the oppressive silence that had reclaimed the space during her absence began to lift like fog burning off in morning sun. Isabella was the first to approach her, appearing in the kitchen where Rosa was preparing lunch with the careful attention that marked everything she did. "Rosa, I'm sorry we didn't defend you," the 17-year-old said, her voice small with shame. "We knew you wouldn't steal anything, but we were scared of grandmother." Rosa looked at this girl who was learning that courage sometimes meant standing against the people you love when they choose cruelty over kindness. She reached out to touch Isabella's cheek gently. "Fear makes us small, Misha, but love makes us brave. You are learning the difference." Sophia joined them soon after, and then Victor, drawn by voices that carried warmth instead of tension. For the first time in anyone's memory, the Hargrave family kitchen became a place where people gathered voluntarily, where conversation happened naturally, where Rosa's presence created space for connections that had been starving in luxury's cold air. Even the Christmas party, held a month late as a New Year's celebration, became something different under Rosa's gentle influence. Instead of an exhibition of wealth designed to intimidate and impress, it transformed into a gathering where guests actually seemed to enjoy themselves, where laughter sounded genuine and food was prepared with love instead of obligation. But the greatest transformation was still to come, involving the one person who had resisted change most fiercely. Constance had retreated to her bedroom for 3 days with what she claimed was a migraine, but which everyone understood was fury at having her authority challenged and her cruelty exposed. She emerged finally, drawn by the sounds of genuine happiness that had begun to fill her house. Sounds she had forgotten were possible. She found Rosa in the living room, carefully dusting the restored vase with its golden veins that caught afternoon light like embedded sunshine. The sight stopped Constance at the doorway, something in Rosa's reverent attention to the mended piece stirring memories she had long buried. "That vase," Constance said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "It was my mother's favorite." Rosa continued her careful work, letting the words settle before responding. "It is more beautiful now, I think. The gold shows where it was broken, but also where it was healed." Constance moved closer, studying the repair work with new eyes. The traditional Japanese technique had indeed transformed damage into art, making the vase's history of breaking and mending part of its essential beauty. "My mother would have hated those gold lines," Constance said, but her tone held wonder rather than criticism. She believed in perfection above everything else. "Perhaps," Rosa said gently, "she never had the chance to learn that some kinds of perfection come only through breaking first." Something in those words, or perhaps in the gentle way they were offered, cracked something in Constance's carefully constructed armor. The old woman sank into a chair she had never occupied while a servant was working, her hands folding in her lap like birds too tired to fly. "I don't know how to be different," she whispered, and the admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did Rosa. Rosa set down her dust cloth and pulled another chair closer, sitting at eye level with a woman who had spent years looking down at everyone around her. "Different is not something we become, Señora Constance. It is something we choose, every morning when we wake up." They sat together in the room where Rosa had been publicly humiliated, surrounded by the silence that had grown warm instead of cold, human instead of empty. Through the windows, Miami's sun painted everything gold, and the restored vase seemed to pulse with light that illuminated more than crystal. That evening, Constance appeared at dinner for the first time in months, taking her seat at the head of a table where her family had gathered not out of obligation but genuine desire to be together. Rosa served the meal she had prepared with particular care, and when Constance tasted the ropa vieja seasoned with secret ingredients and careful love, tears touched her eyes, the first tears anyone had seen her shed in years. "Rosa," she said, her voice careful with unfamiliar humility, "would you join us? There's a place set for you." Rosa looked at the chair pulled up to the dining room table, at the formal place setting that declared her an equal rather than a servant, at the faces around the table that showed hope rather than obligation. "Si, Señora Constance," she said, settling into a chair at the table she had served but never joined. "I would be honored." The meal that followed was imperfect in all the best ways. Conversation stumbled over years of practiced distance. Laughter came cautiously at first and then more freely, and Rosa found herself not serving but sharing, her stories of Puerto Rico and Miami's neighborhoods adding flavor to discussions that had been starved for authentic human connection. Months passed like pages turning in a beloved book, each one writing new chapters in the story of the Hargrave family's gradual awakening. The mansion traded its museum silence for something that sounded remarkably like a home. Doors that opened freely, voices that carried welcome instead of warning, spaces that invited lingering instead of demanding quick passage. Victor began joining Rosa in the kitchen some mornings, learning to prepare café con leche the way she had taught Isabella, asking questions about her nephew Miguel's college applications, and offering help that felt generous rather than condescending. The daughters started bringing friends home, no longer embarrassed by what they might find, but proud of the warmth that had transformed their previously perfect but cold environment. Even Constance surprised everyone, including herself, by establishing a scholarship fund for young women from immigrant families pursuing education, a project she discussed with Rosa as an equal partner rather than a beneficiary of her charity. The restored vase remained on its pedestal in the living room, its golden scars catching light at different times of day, reminding everyone who saw it that the most beautiful things often carried visible proof of having been broken and chosen to heal. On a warm April evening, 13 months after Rosa's return, the family gathered on the mansion's terrace overlooking Biscayne Bay. The view was spectacular, Miami's skyline glittering like scattered diamonds, cruise ships moving through dark water like floating cities, stars appearing as the sky deepened from blue to black. Rosa sat among them not as an employee, but as someone who belonged, her voice joining the comfortable conversation that flowed around the table like tide around welcoming shores. Miguel was there too, having been accepted to the University of Miami with scholarship help that the family had arranged quietly, his future bright with possibilities that Rosa's sacrifices had made real. Victor raised his glass of wine, a vintage that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but which tasted like celebration rather than exhibition. To Rosa, he said, his voice carrying weight that came from transformation rather than tradition, "Who taught us the difference between a house and a home?" To Rosa, the others echoed, their words creating harmony that money could never buy, but love had made possible. Rosa smiled, her weathered hands folding in her lap, her heart full of the particular satisfaction that comes from work completed not just with skill, but with grace. She thought of her mother's words, carried across years and miles. "Cuando te caes, te levantas más fuerte." When you fall, you rise stronger. She had fallen, been broken like crystal on marble floors. But she had also risen, and in rising had lifted others with her, proving that strength sometimes looked like softness, that power sometimes wore the disguise of service, that healing sometimes required the patient work of women whose hands knew how to mend what others had given up as irreparable. The Miami night wrapped around them like a blessing, warm air carrying the scent of jasmine and possibility, the sound of water lapping against distant docks, the promise of tomorrow bringing new chances to choose kindness over cruelty, connection over isolation, love over fear. In the distance the city sparkled with millions of lights, each one representing a life being lived, a story being written, a heart learning the difference between surviving and thriving. Rosa's story had become part of that constellation, her quiet revolution joining countless others in the slow, persistent transformation of the world one relationship at a time. But Rosa's influence extended beyond the walls of the Hargrave mansion, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Word of the household's transformation spread through Miami's complex social networks in the way that important news always does, quietly at first, then with gathering momentum as people recognized truth when they encountered it. Other domestic workers in Coral Gables began to notice subtle changes in their own workplaces. The Hargraves' example, like all genuine transformations, couldn't be contained within a single address. Employers who had once treated their staff as invisible began making small adjustments, remembering names, saying please and thank you, acknowledging the humanity of people who made their comfortable lives possible. At the community center in Hialeah, where Rosa had volunteered during her weeks of unemployment, her story became legend among the elderly immigrants she'd helped navigate bureaucratic mazes. They spoke of her with the reverence reserved for saints, the woman who had transformed humiliation into dignity, who had proven that grace under pressure wasn't just an empty phrase, but a living practice. Don Aurelio's repair shop became a pilgrimage site of sorts for people who understood the metaphor of the golden-veined vase. He found himself working on more than crystal and porcelain. People brought him their broken hearts disguised as damaged heirlooms, seeking not just restoration but the kind of healing that made scars beautiful rather than shameful. La Rosa de Oro, he began calling her when regulars asked about the famous vase repair. The Golden Rose, because she turned breaking into blooming, endings into beginnings. Miguel Martinez, now flourishing at the University of Miami, carried his aunt's lessons into his studies with the same quiet determination that had sustained Rosa through her darkest professional moments. His business classes were enriched by understanding that true success wasn't measured only in profit margins, but in the dignity preserved and the kindness cultivated along the way. His dorm room friends, mostly from wealthy Coral Gables families themselves, found themselves questioning assumptions they'd inherited about class and worth after spending time with Miguel. His stories about his aunt's experience opened conversations about privilege and power that many of them had never considered before. Meanwhile, the Hargrave daughters had become ambassadors of change within their own peer group. Isabella's poetry, increasingly influenced by themes of social justice and authentic connection, began appearing in local literary magazines. Her verses about invisible labor and visible grace struck chords with readers who recognized their own households in her carefully crafted words. Sophia's college applications essays, focused on her family's journey toward understanding their responsibility as wealthy citizens, caught the attention of admissions committees at schools known for their social consciousness. Her writing, about learning to see servants as teachers, employees as family, demonstrated a maturity that impressed even cynical admissions officers. The scholarship fund that Constance had established in Rosa's honor grew beyond its original modest parameters. As word spread through Miami's philanthropic circles, other wealthy families began contributing, drawn by the fund's simple but powerful mission, supporting young women whose circumstances had taught them resilience but whose dreams deserved financial backing. By its second year, the Rosa Martinez Educational Foundation was awarding 10 scholarships annually to daughters of domestic workers, janitors, gardeners, and other invisible laborers who kept Miami's wealthy neighborhoods functioning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that money earned through the exploitation of working families was being redirected to ensure their children could break generational cycles of economic limitation. But perhaps the most profound change occurred within Constance herself, whose transformation from brittle matriarch to genuine grandmother amazed everyone who witnessed it. Her conversations with Rosa during that first vulnerable afternoon had opened emotional doors she'd kept locked since her own mother's death decades earlier. She began volunteering at literacy programs in Little Havana, using her fluent Spanish and commanding presence to help adult students navigate English grammar with the same authority she'd once used to intimidate her own household staff. Her students, mostly recent immigrants working multiple jobs to support families, found unexpected encouragement from a woman who looked like everything they'd been taught to fear about wealthy Americans. Senora Constance, they called her, and she wore the title with pride she hadn't felt in years. These evening classes became the highlight of her week, replacing the endless charity luncheons and social obligations that had filled her calendar with activities that felt meaningful rather than merely social. Her relationship with Rosa evolved into something neither had anticipated. Not quite friendship in the traditional sense, but a mutual respect built on shared understanding of women's capacity to survive and transform circumstances that seemed impossibly difficult. They discovered common ground in their experiences as strong women who had learned to navigate worlds controlled by other people's expectations. Victor's grief, which had defined his existence since Margaret's death, began to shift from paralyzing sorrow to motivating gratitude. Rosa's presence hadn't erased his loss, but it had shown him how to honor Margaret's memory through actions rather than just through mourning. He established a foundation in his late wife's name, focused on supporting widow mutual aid societies, particularly those serving immigrant communities. The work gave him purpose beyond managing inherited wealth, connecting him to people whose losses, while different from his own, shared the universal experience of learning to rebuild life after devastation. He found healing in helping others heal, community in joining rather than standing apart from shared human struggles. The mansion itself reflected these changes in countless small ways. Rooms that had been formal showcases became spaces where people actually lived. The kitchen, once sterile as a museum display, now hummed with constant activity as family members learned to cook together, sharing stories while chopping vegetables and stirring sauces that filled the house with aromas of home rather than hotel. The living room, where the vase had been broken and restored, became a gathering place where Rosa told stories of Puerto Rico to daughters who'd never heard their father's childhood tales, where Constance shared memories of her own immigrant grandparents that had been buried under decades of assimilation and ambition. Evening meals became anticipated events rather than obligatory performances. The dining room table, once set with porcelain precision for silent consumption, now welcomed messy conversations about everything from Isabella's latest poems to Miguel's engineering studies to Victor's foundation work to Constance's literacy students' breakthrough moments. Even the mansion's acoustics seemed different. Laughter echoed off marble floors that had grown accustomed to whispered conversations and carefully modulated voices. Music drifted through hallways where silence had once reigned supreme. The house had found its voice, and that voice spoke of belonging rather than exclusion, warmth rather than perfection. Rosa moved through these transformed spaces with quiet satisfaction, understanding that her real work had never been cleaning surfaces or preparing meals, but creating conditions where authentic relationships could flourish. The house had become what she'd always known it could be, not just a display of wealth, but a foundation for wealth's responsible use. Her own living situation had improved dramatically as well. Victor had quietly arranged for Rosa and Miguel to move into a beautiful apartment in a building he owned near the University of Miami campus. Close enough to Miguel's classes and to the mansion that commutes became easier, but far enough from her previous neighborhood that the upgrade felt significant without feeling like charity. The apartment's large kitchen became a laboratory where Rosa experimented with recipes that blended her Puerto Rican heritage with influences from the Cuban, Colombian, and Haitian neighbors who made up Miami's gloriously complex cultural landscape. These dishes then made their way to the Hargrave table, expanding palates that had been limited to country club dining and expensive restaurants with little soul. More importantly, the new apartment had space for Rosa to entertain, something that had been impossible in her previous cramped quarters. She hosted dinners for Miami's network of domestic workers, creating a support system where women who spent their days serving others could gather as honored guests in comfortable surroundings. These gatherings became strategic as well as social, evolving into informal organizing meetings where women shared information about fair employers, problem households, and ways to support each other through the particular challenges of their work. Rosa found herself becoming an unofficial advocate, helping women navigate conflicts with employers, negotiate better working conditions, and access resources they hadn't known existed. Her reputation in these circles grew beyond her story of personal triumph to encompass her ability to help others achieve their own victories. Women sought her advice about everything from requesting raises to dealing with discriminatory treatment to finding better job opportunities. The Hargrave name, once synonymous with cold privilege in Miami's domestic worker network, became associated with fair treatment and genuine respect. Other wealthy families began asking Victor for recommendations about how to improve relationships with their household staff, recognizing that the changes in his family's dynamics had created something worth emulating. These consultations led to a broader initiative that Victor and Rosa developed together. Workshops for wealthy families about ethical household management, covering everything from fair wages and working conditions to cultural sensitivity and professional respect. The sessions were always fully booked, attended by people who recognized that their households' atmospheres could be transformed through relatively simple changes in attitude and practice. Rosa discovered that she had a gift for teaching these concepts without lecturing or shaming participants. Her approach was always gentle but clear, helping employers understand that treating domestic workers with dignity wasn't charity but justice, wasn't optional courtesy but basic human decency. The workshops generated enough interest and income to become a formal consulting business that Rosa ran from the mansion's converted sunroom, which had been transformed into a comfortable office space where she could meet with clients and coordinate the expanding network of support services she was developing. Her business cards, elegantly printed on cardstock supplied by Constance, read simply, Rosa Martinez, Household Relations Consultant, but everyone knew that her real expertise was in human relations, in the delicate art of building bridges across divides that seemed permanent but were actually just entrenched. The success of these efforts attracted attention beyond Miami's borders. Rosa began receiving invitations to speak at conferences about domestic worker rights, household ethics, and the intersection of class privilege with moral responsibility. Her presentations, always delivered in English that carried the music of her native Spanish, moved audiences who had never considered the human cost of their comfortable lifestyles. At one particularly memorable conference in New York City, Rosa shared the stage with labor organizers, academics, and policy advocates who had spent careers fighting for domestic worker rights. But her approach was different from theirs, less confrontational, more invitational, focused on helping employers discover the joy that came from creating equitable relationships rather than just avoiding legal liability. I do not ask anyone to give up their beautiful homes or comfortable lives, she said during her keynote presentation. I ask only that they understand the hands that clean your crystal, that prepare your meals, that care for your children. These hands belong to women with dreams as precious as your own, with families as important as your own, with dignity that deserves protection as much as your own. The standing ovation that followed wasn't polite conference applause, but genuine recognition of truth spoken with authority earned through experience. Several attendees approached her afterward with job offers, think tank positions, university appointments, foundation directorships that would have paid impressive salaries and carried significant prestige. Rosa listened politely to each offer, thanked the speakers for their confidence, and explained that her work was in Miami, with the families who had taught her that transformation happened one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time, one choice at a time to see each other as fully human. She returned to Miami carrying business cards from influential people across the country, but more importantly, carrying validation that her approach, gentle but persistent, individual but systemic, was reaching people who controlled resources and made policies that affected millions of domestic workers nationwide. Miguel graduated from the University of Miami with a degree in engineering and economics, but also with an understanding of social justice that had been shaped by watching his aunt turn personal triumph into community transformation. His thesis project focused on sustainable development in low-income communities, combining technical expertise with the human insight Rosa had modeled throughout his upbringing. At his graduation ceremony, Rosa sat in the front row wearing a dress Constance had selected and paid for. not as charity, but as gratitude. One woman honoring another woman's achievement. The sight of Rosa Martinez in the audience of that prestigious ceremony represented millions of immigrant women whose sacrifices made their children's education possible, but who rarely received recognition for their contributions. When Miguel's name was called, and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he stopped at the microphone that graduates typically used for brief thank yous to family members. But Miguel's words were different from the usual acknowledgments. "This degree belongs to my aunt, Rosa Martinez, who taught me that success without service is emptiness, that education without empathy is useless, and that privilege without responsibility is poverty of the soul. Tia Rosa, this is for you, and for every woman who cleans offices after midnight, so her nephew can study until dawn." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Miguel, but for Rosa, for all the invisible women whose labor made other people's dreams possible. In that audience full of wealthy families and successful graduates, recognition flowed toward a woman in a modest dress whose greatest achievement wasn't what she had accumulated, but what she had transformed. After the ceremony, as families gathered for celebration dinners at expensive restaurants, the Hargraves hosted a party at the mansion that included not just Miguel and Rosa, but the community center volunteers, Don Aurelio from the repair shop, Maria Santos and the other household staff, neighbors from Rosa's former apartment building, and her literacy class students who had become Constance's informal extended family. The mansion's formal dining room, designed for exclusive gatherings, welcomed this diverse group with tables set not with the finest china, but with dishes that Rosa had selected. Beautiful but sturdy, elegant but welcoming, precious because of the hands that had prepared them and the hearts that had gathered around them. Conversations flowed in Spanish and English, sometimes simultaneously as bilingual speakers translated for others, creating the kind of authentic, multicultural dialogue that Miami's tourism promotions promised but rarely delivered. Children from the neighborhood played in gardens that had been strictly ornamental, their laughter echoing off marble steps that had grown warm with human use. As evening settled over Biscayne Bay and the party moved to the terrace, Rosa found herself standing beside the restored vase, which Constance had moved to a place of honor on the outdoor sideboard. The golden veins caught light from paper lanterns that Miguel had strung earlier, creating patterns that seemed to dance across the crystal surface. "It really is more beautiful now," said a voice behind her. Rosa turned to find Victor approaching with 2 cups of café con leche, prepared the way she had taught him months earlier. "Sí," Rosa agreed, accepting the coffee and inhaling its familiar comfort. But it was always beautiful. It just needed time to show its strength. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the party that had grown beyond celebration into community, beyond gratitude into genuine connection. The mansion around them hummed with voices and laughter, with music and movement, with the particular energy that emerges when people discover they can trust each other across lines that had seemed permanent. Victor studied Rosa's profile in the soft light, still amazed by the transformation she had brought to his family's life. Not just the obvious changes, the warmth, the connection, the sense of purpose that had replaced their previous emptiness, but the subtle ones as well. The way his daughters carried themselves with confidence earned rather than inherited. The way his mother's face had softened into something that looked almost like joy. The way he himself had learned to live with Margaret's death not as a wound that defined him, but as a love that continued to guide him. "Rosa," he said, setting down his coffee cup to focus completely on his words, "I know I've thanked you before, but I want to be sure you understand what you've given us. It's not just the housekeeping, not just the cooking, not even just the kindness. You've shown us how to be better people." Rosa smiled, the expression carrying years of understanding about the difference between gratitude and recognition, between appreciation and respect. "Señor Victor, I did not change anyone. I only created space where people could choose to change themselves." The distinction was important, capturing something essential about Rosa's approach to transformation. She had never imposed her values on the family, never demanded they adopt her perspectives, never insisted they abandon their privileges or their lifestyles. Instead, she had simply lived her own values so consistently, so gracefully, that others were inspired to examine their own choices. Miguel appeared at her elbow, his graduation cap slightly askew, and his face glowing with the satisfaction of achievement shared with people who understood its significance. "Tia Rosa, Mrs. Constance wants to make a toast before people start leaving." They rejoined the group gathering around tables that had been cleared of dinner dishes, but still carried the warmth of shared celebration. Constance stood at the head of the main table holding a glass of wine that caught light like liquid amber. Her silver hair was softer than usual, styled for celebration rather than intimidation, and her dress was elegant but approachable, expensive but not exclusionary. "Friends," she began, her voice carrying authority but not arrogance, "we gather tonight to celebrate Miguel's graduation, but also to acknowledge the woman who made it possible through her sacrifices, her wisdom, and her grace." She paused, looking directly at Rosa, with eyes that held admiration rather than the cold calculation that had once defined her gaze. "Rosa Martinez came to work in our house 18 months ago, and in that time she has taught us lessons that no university could provide. She has shown us that dignity cannot be bought or sold, only recognized and honored. She has demonstrated that strength often wears the disguise of gentleness, that power often expresses itself through service, and that wisdom often speaks in voices that the world has taught us to ignore." The gathering had grown quiet, understanding that they were witnessing something significant, not just a toast, but a testimony, not just thanks, but transformation made visible through words. "But most importantly," Constance continued, her voice growing stronger with emotion, "Rosa has shown us that families are not just born but built, not just inherited but chosen, not just defined by blood but by the love we decide to share." She raised her glass toward Rosa, and throughout the gathering others followed her example. Wine glasses and coffee cups and water glasses held high in recognition of a woman whose greatest achievement was helping others discover their own capacity for grace. "To Rosa Martinez," Constance declared, "who taught us that the most valuable things cannot be purchased, only practiced. And to all of you who have shown us that home is not a place but a feeling, not a building but a community." The toast that followed carried across the mansion's terrace and gardens, echoing off water and sky, joining the countless expressions of gratitude that rise from human hearts when people discover they are capable of more love, more justice, more connection than they had dared to imagine. As the evening wound down and guests gradually departed, carrying with them the memory of celebration that had transcended social boundaries, Rosa began the gentle work of gathering glasses and clearing surfaces, but she was quickly joined by Isabella and Sophia, by Victor and Constance, by Miguel and the other staff members, all working together to restore the space while preserving the memory of what had transpired there. The party's end felt not like conclusion but like beginning, not like return to normal but like establishment of a new normal where celebration included service, where gratitude expressed itself through action, where the mansion's beauty encompassed not just its architecture and furnishings, but the relationships that filled its rooms with meaning. Later, after the last guest had left and the family had said their good nights, Rosa walked through the quiet house one final time, turning off lights and checking doors with the practiced routine that had become second nature over months of employment that had evolved into something much deeper. But tonight the routine felt different. Instead of the solitary patrol of a security guard, it felt like the loving attention of someone checking on family, ensuring that the space they all shared was peaceful and protected for the dreams it would shelter through the night. In the living room, the restored vase gleamed in light from the table lamp Rosa always left burning for Victor, who sometimes wandered the house during his still difficult nights when grief visited unexpectedly. The golden veins seemed to pulse with their own illumination, testament to the Japanese wisdom that beauty and strength often emerged from breaking and healing rather than from never being tested. Rosa paused before the vase, remembering the terror she'd felt when it shattered, the humiliation of Constance's accusations, the despair of those weeks when employment seemed impossible and dignity felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. All of that seemed not transformed, but essential now. Necessary components of a journey that had led to discoveries none of them could have planned. She thought of her mother's voice, carried across years and ocean. Cuando te caes, te levantas más fuerte. The words had proven prophetic, but not in ways her mother could have imagined. The strength hadn't come from simply surviving hardship, but from using that survival to help others discover their own capacity for resilience and grace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the lessons they'd all learned about seeing each other clearly, treating each other justly, loving each other authentically. The mansion would continue its transformation from monument to wealth into foundation for service, from showcase of privilege into platform for justice. Rosa climbed the stairs toward her own room. No longer the servants' quarters, but a comfortable space on the second floor that recognized her status as family, rather than employee. Each step carried her upward not just physically but metaphorically, ascending toward rest that felt earned and dreams that felt possible. Behind her the house settled into peaceful quiet, but it was a different silence than the one that had once defined these rooms. This quiet hummed with connection rather than isolation, with satisfaction rather than emptiness, with the particular contentment that comes when people discover they are capable of living up to their highest aspirations. And you? Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without ever saying it out loud? Have you ever been the quiet strength holding someone else's world together while your own seemed to be falling apart? Tell me your story in the comments below, because I know you have one. We all do. If this story touched something deep in your heart, leave a like and subscribe to share hope with another woman who needs it today. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that dignity cannot be bought or sold, only chosen again and again in the small moments that make up a life. For more heartfelt stories that honor the invisible heroes among us, click the link in the description. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with me. Your presence here, listening to stories that matter, is its own form of quiet revolution. I'll see you in our next story, where we'll explore another heart learning to heal.